So, feminist gets owned by men's rights activist. That's what I like to see.
Well, joining me now is Stephanie Davis-Arai from No More Page 3.
Page 3 is just naked women in the newspapers, and they did eventually get rid of it, so now those topless models can't make a living. But never mind.
Absolutely. I think sexism has been so normalised that when you do talk about incidents, it's kind of like, be serious, it's not a big deal. So I think a project like that allows people to go, actually, no, this has been happening and it's not okay, that's been happening and it's not okay, and kind of see how many people it's happening to, like, oh, it's not just me.
What's been happening, though? Like, give examples, give actual concrete examples of whatever it is that you're complaining about.
Loads of people are affected by this issue.
What do you think when you see forums like that?
I think it's amazing what Laura Bates has done. I think everyday sexism, in a sense, grew organically from one woman deciding to sort of...
I'm not really in a position to comment, but this is some pretty bad audio recording. But that's a criticism of London Live and not of the politics of the situation.
Put something on a website, and then there was a flood, and just from the amount of entries onto the Everyday Sexism Project website, you can see what a huge problem it is. And women, young girls, all ages, talking about the sexism they've experienced throughout their lifetime and often haven't told anybody about before.
So I went and checked out Everyday Sexism, and it's about what you'd expect. A lot of implausible stuff. One woman saying she'd been pulled over by the police for being a woman. A lot of stuff that just isn't sexism. You know, being a victim of violent crime when you're a woman, and it's actually less likely you'll be a victim of violent crime, that's not sexism. And catcalling. Lots and lots of stuff about catcalling, but I don't think that's really sexism either. And certainly it's not a legal or institutional form of sexism.
Now, everyday sexism, Mike, as a term, what do you think of that?
I think there's plenty of everyday sexism, but the serious sexism is against men and boys.
And that's Mike Buchanan from the Justice for Men and Boys Party, and yeah, he's right. He's objectively right in terms of all of the main statistics and metrics for life outcomes. And Buchanan there does get a little bit inflammatory with his description of how the women are behaving, but, you know, I think that's acceptable given that he's factually correct.
Could I ask?
I think that you should have to tolerate sexual harassment, and I think the fact that the project is being discussed in that way, I think it's one thing to disagree, but I think when you start personally attacking someone who's created this project, which has had engagement from like tens of thousands of women, I think...
What can I say? There's lots of whiny women out there, and she's creating more of them.
You see, he gets controversial, but I don't think an argument from popularity is really very convincing. And something being influential when it's completely and objectively wrong isn't actually a good thing.
Mike, if you had have female relatives, friends who came to you with a story of being touched inappropriately or spoken to inappropriately out and about, would your response be the same to them?
Can we not lump in touched inappropriately and spoken to inappropriately? Someone speaking to you in a way you don't like and someone sexually touching you without your consent are two very, very different things. And one of those things is a pretty serious criminal offence and should be dealt with as such.
I'd expect them as strong women to deal with it at the time. You know, at the end of the day...
How would you see them deal with it?
Well, I would think, you know, if a woman's groped on a bus, for example, I think, I hardly like to sort of suggest physical violence, but, a slap or something of the man concerned, it would be appropriate.
Well, physical violence may be justified, but it's only legally appropriate if you need to deter ongoing acts of criminal aggression against yourself. So I think reporting it to the proper authorities would be a far more appropriate course of action.
Saying everyday blathering on about mainly everyday occurrences that most people don't even register.
But I think that points to what we were discussing earlier about things being normalised.
Normalisation is a pretty big issue for everyday sexism against men. At a time when the government are talking about introducing hate crime legislation for any crime against women, the fact that most crime against men seems to be frequently overlooked. The most violent crime has always been committed against men, but that's never presented as a hate crime issue. That's always just treated as being the way that things are. But I don't think any of that really applies to women.
you know, it is just ridiculous to think that. I mean, it's a tiny number of men who are doing this stuff, and to paint the whole of mankind, you know, all men with that brush, I think is outrageous.
I'm not sure who's painting all men with the brush.
I mean, programs like Teach Men Not to Rape, or the various advertising programs from the last few years that the government put out, telling men to cross the street to avoid women so they don't spook them at night. I don't think it's misrepresenting feminist positions to represent them as just men bad. That's very much how it is. But yeah, the reality is that violence is mostly committed by a tiny minority of men, well under 1%. And those are 1% that have reason, normally having been disadvantaged, having been victims of violence and so forth. Of course, that doesn't really fit the narrative that's being presented here, because the narrative being presented here is just man bad.
I mean, it's everything from self-esteem and kind of what opportunities are available to you, whether you begin to kind of shrink yourself to fit into society's expectations, or you're specifically told, no, you can't do this because of X. And then there's things like domestic violence. 1 in 3 women will have experienced domestic violence in their lifetime.
You know, it's nice to see them use a statistic, no matter how wrong it might be, because the rest of that stuff was just airy-fairy vague nonsense. The effects of everyday sexism are being told that you can't do this because of X. What because of what? Well, that's a mystery for the ages.
Add up, and over a lifetime you're constantly reminded as a woman that you're there just as sexual entertainment, just as something for men to enjoy, and you're constantly reduced to that level. And every woman has her stories from childhood onwards of that kind of treatment, and the impact, I think, is huge, and I think it's bigger than we actually recognise.
So the woman with the anti-softcore porn t-shirt is obviously sex negative. But you know, there's a big difference between being there just to be sexually appealing or entertaining or whatever else, and being there and also being sexually appealing and entertaining. Being regarded as attractive, being regarded as, just being popular, being appealing to people, is being presented here as an unmitigated evil, which it just objectively isn't.
Now, sexism, of course, affects both men and women, and I know that's something that you're interested in, but have you yourself ever experienced sexism?
Indeed, yes. About 5 or 6 years ago, I went for a management consulting position, a business consulting position in the public sector, and was turned down by a pretty vile feminist who had never been known to take on a male consultant. In fact, she just never, but she had to interview males. So that she could say that she saw as many males as females. But she would, the agency I went to admitted in the end that she would far sooner take on an incompetent woman than a competent man.
You need to get that shit on tape, because that's a serious offence. That's something you can sue them for, get compensation and so forth. Most of the time anyway. There are exemptions under the Equalities Act, unfortunately.
And to personal individual examples, of course there are going to be examples of the opposite happening. Of course there are. Okay. But overall, the sort of there's a very laddish sexist culture which holds women back on a far greater scale than it holds men back.
It's always a little bit funny to hear feminists talk about what they think sexism is. Because on the anti-feminist side, we're talking about the life expectancy, we're talking about educational statistics and wealth and the criminal justice system and, sentencing disparities and things like that. And then you talk to feminists and, well, it's a laddish culture. That's the big problem. And it's holding women back in invisible and very difficult to explain ways. And so don't expect her to give any examples of how women are being held back, just this bare assertion is the best you're going to get.
To be joking. There's nothing holding women back. There's a great deal. I mean, I lead the political party Justice for Men and Boys. And in there, we'll have 17 areas in our manifesto where the state assaults the human rights and interests of men and boys.
I've got to look up their manifesto, but I'm sure that if we looked at the Women's Equality Party manifesto, then we'd find a complete lack of issues of that sort. Okay, so I went and checked the Women's Equality Party website. As far as I can tell, they don't have a specific manifesto, but they have a set of objectives, which include equal treatment in education and in healthcare. Maybe someone should tell them how privileged women are in those areas right now. But basically their aims seem to be what you'd expect, to centre gender and sex in all of their policies, to make sure that women are the ones who benefit from those policies, and to take areas where women are already benefited and discriminate even more in favour of them. But in all the documents I read, I didn't find a single example of an area where the state currently disadvantages women. So, yes, Mike Buchanan was completely right.
But that's just one of countless lying feminist narratives that we expose all the time.
I suggest you go and look at Counting Dead Women and the number of women who've been killed so far this year, and it supports that statistic.
Yeah, Counting Dead Women, that's a thing that exists. It's part of the International Femicide Census, which assumes that every woman killed by a man was killed solely because she was a woman. And is probably best known in this country for donating the list of victims of male violence that Jess Phillips reads out in Parliament every International Women's Day. And according to the website, in the last calendar year there were 107 women in Britain who were killed primarily or entirely by man or men. Although looking on the Counting Dead Women Twitter account, they do include some who had female murderers as at least one of the killers. Also, 107 is a pretty low number, significantly lower than the number that was given by the article in the Morning Star in the last video.
I'm going to bring in some comments from our viewers now, because obviously this is a subject that's got a lot of people talking on our Facebook page. Let's have a look at some of the things you've been saying. So Francine says, some women believe in sexism and get offended at the slightest little thing, whereas men just don't seem bothered. I'm all for a bit of feminism and standing up for equal rights, but it seems to be going too far these days, and it's like trying to take over the world. So is it a case of women being too sensitive sometimes? Would you ever see an argument for that?
I think men tend to be somewhat undersensitive on this issue. There is a tendency, and this is well documented in statistics on things like online abuse for example. People get abused online, people get harassed, they get death threats. That's actually much more likely to happen to men than women. But when it happens to women, those women believe that it happens to them because they're women, rather than in spite of them being women, probably because of all the propaganda they get from the feminist movement. Men, on the other hand, are much more likely to be victims, but generally regard themselves as not being victims, or at least as not being victims because of their sex. For a man, it's just a bad thing that happened to him, rather than a form of institutional abuse or whatever. So, room for improvement for both men and women in opposite ways.
I think sometimes people get a little bit uncomfortable when people are trying to achieve equality, because it means making space for people that have thus far been marginalised. But
feminist statements are always so ironic. There's always so much projection in there. But yes, technically she's right, of course. That there is a lot of talk about equality from a feminist point of view, and they tend to get very uncomfortable and very aggressive whenever the discussion moves on to things that affect men instead. I suppose they're just uncomfortable to be losing the monopoly on their soapbox. And the rest of the discussion is mostly about page-free girls, so I'd say that's about it.